Hello everybody, I'm David. Welcome back to the workshop, and we're going to continue our series on small outboard motors. In the previous videos we looked at starting problems and some solutions for those. Now we're just going to look at the annual maintenance tasks and how to carry those out. Most of them are pretty straightforward. The one that can sometimes be a bit fiddly and which has the potential to damage the motor if you get it wrong is the change of the impeller. And since that's the most difficult one, we're going to look at that one first. You'll see I've got my outboard raised up here. That's just for convenience for filming. It's not something probably you want to do at home because lifting it up there is quite difficult. It's very heavy, and if it falls on you, you'll regret it. So probably best to keep your motor on the stand a bit lower down. So let's get going with the impeller and see how we get on. So to get the impeller out then, we need to drop the gearbox and the propeller unit from the bottom of the motor here. To get that off, we're going to need just a few tools. Flat bladed screwdriver so that we can take out this rubber plug here, a 10mm socket and a 13mm socket. Let's get on with that and see how we do. I'll bring the camera in a little bit closer so that you can see better what we're doing here. Inside the port here, there's a metal clamp that holds the gear change linkage lower piece to the upper piece, and that's held with a 10mm bolt. We want to just slacken that bolt off. We're not going to take it all the way out, just slacken it off. There we go. Once that's done, we can remove the bolts under here, which will allow us to drop this lower part of the motor. I want to point out that the motor is actually in neutral at the moment, and we want it to stay that way. We don't want to change it in and out of gear whilst we're doing that. It needs to stay in neutral, otherwise we'll have fun later on trying to reposition this clamp when we come to put it all back together. Let's just tilt the motor back now and get it in a better position so that we can remove the nuts underneath. So there are these two nuts underneath which we need to release. The 10mm one on the forward edge here. That's him. Now there's a washer on there. We don't want to lose that. And also another washer on the 13mm. Then we can remove the whole leg. And there it is, a complete unit removed from the motor. Okay, so we've got the gearbox and propeller unit off, and we can go forward and start dismantling the water pump and changing the impeller. But before we do that, there's something that you need to watch out for, and it's really important. If you forget everything else that's in this video, this one thing could save you from trashing your motor. Inside the pump housing here is the impeller, and the impeller is mounted on this shaft, the drive shaft, which also drives the propeller, and it's fixed in place on this shaft by a tiny little metal key, effectively a Woodruff key, that locks it to the shaft, so that when the shaft spins, the impeller also spins, and that drives the water through the output port here and up to the engine where it cools the motor. That little key is really small and it's not held in place by anything. Once you take this the cover off the pump here, it's free to fall out. It's very tiny, really easy to miss it. And if you don't spot that it's in there and it falls off to one side, and you then reassemble the motor without that pin in place, the impeller will not be turning when the engine runs. So there'll be no cooling water going up to the engine. It's very likely then that the engine will seize and it will be permanently damaged. So before you take this thing apart, make sure you're on a clean working area and that you're ready to look for that little key. It's like a little pin before you take the motor apart, and make sure that you've saved it. Okay, so I'll bring the camera in a bit closer now. We can take a look at what happens when we remove the bolts and take the top off the pump housing. The pump housing is held on with 4 10mm bolts, which we are going to remove. And now if you look right there is the little pin that I was just talking about, and you can see it's immediately fallen away and it's minute. This thing is probably about 8mm long and no more than 2mm diameter. It's absolutely tiny, and I've dropped it, and there it is. And that's the thing that we must try not to lose. We can now just take off the pump housing, put them to one side, and you can see the old impeller. This one does need changing. It's looking pretty dodgy. It's worth just noting the direction of rotation here, which, looking from above, is clockwise. So when we put the thing back together, we want to make sure we take note of that. Take him off, put it in there, put that little pin carefully in the parts box. And there we go. What you can see on the side of the shaft, that flat there, is where that little pin locates, and it effectively locks that impeller onto the shaft. Now that we've got the pump housing free, we can go ahead and we can replace the impeller. There is another service part inside the pump housing. That's this lining here, which is a little metal piece. That too is a replacement part. If your lining is a little bit worn, then you can replace it with this. This particular engine has only done a few hours, so it's not worth touching it on here. Similarly, the gaskets on the joint face here, They could also be replaced, and they're usually in the service kit. These are in absolutely perfect condition, so again, I'm not going to touch those. The parts we're going to need then for this particular job is just the impeller, and we're also going to use a little bit of this water resistant grease. So first of all, I'll clean up the joint, make sure there's no dirt going to be trapped in there. Then we'll lubricate it, we'll put the impeller in, put it all back together again. I'm just going to put a little bit of grease on the gasket face here, just to help it seal. No need to overdo it. A little bit on top of the linkage, and here on the splines for the drive shaft. Down the bottom here on the gear change, so that he slides in and out nicely. Put a little bit in there and make sure then that's free. This too we want to be lubricated. Inside the impeller housing, and we're going to lubricate the impeller too, because the first time it starts this will be running dry until it gets a little bit of water in there. We don't want to damage the impeller. Okay. We then drop the impeller back over the shaft, like so. We bring the housing back over, like so. Now we want a small pair of pliers, and at this point we're going to replace this little pin that's so important, and in order to get that to stick in place whilst we bring the impeller down, I just put some grease on the landing place there. To stick it into place. Then we can slide the impeller down. I just need to find, can't quite see where the hole is. Okay, so there's a learning point. We've put so much grease on here that I can no longer see where is the joint, and it's the hole is just there. So we'll bring that one back down again. And there he goes. So that impeller, as you can see, it can move a little bit, but only so far, and it's locked onto that little pin there, onto the key. To get this to engage properly, we're just going to turn the shaft clockwise whilst we press home the housing. And now, yeah, she's all engaged, and we can replace the bolts. A little bit of grease on each one so that we'll be able to get them out in the future. Tighten them up evenly so that the pump housing goes down square. Just give the shaft a little turn every now and then to make sure that it's all settling down properly. And that's it. The impeller's in, pump's reassembled, and now we can fit this back into the motor. The gear change linkage has to slide through the hole in this little clamp just here, which connects it to the upper part of the gear change linkage. At the same time, the drive shaft must go through this hole here and right up into the motor and connect into a splined socket beneath the actual motor unit. At the same time, this pipe here needs to fit into the water outlet connection on top of the gearbox. So all three of those things have to be aligned perfectly before anything will fit together. There's one little thing that we can do to try and help with that. The gear change linkage that we're just going to fit in has not only to fit through that little clamp, but the top of it must emerge through this hole here. And that hole is usually fitted with a rubber grommet like that. I've removed that just to try and make things a little bit easier. You may want to do the same. It'll give us a little bit more clearance there. Now this task is sometimes quite troublesome, and it may take a little bit of time. You could be lucky, it might work first time for you, but it can be a little bit troublesome. It might be useful to have a friend to help, and possibly to try and rotate the motor a little bit whilst you're trying to assemble everything. So let's start by reinserting the assembly into the leg like this. Okay, and he's in there. And at this point, we have to just try and move them about a little bit until we can get engagement of the drive shaft in the socket at the top. Well, trying to reassemble the bottom part of the leg unit into the main part of the motor here, and to get the drive shaft to align with the splines on the bottom of the crankshaft has actually proved to be very difficult. So I've decided to try a different approach. I fitted a cargo strap, a ratchet strap around the bottom here to pull the leg up, and I've put the propeller now into gear. It's in reverse gear, so that by turning the propeller I can actually turn the shaft at the same time, and hopefully then I can get the splines to align and the thing will behave itself and go into place. That's what we can try. So here we are. We've had to relocate the motor to the workshop of a friend of mine who's a pretty good mechanic, and finally we've turned the thing upside down, lowered the propeller and gearbox unit in from above, and by doing it that way we finally managed to engage the shaft in the socket and to refit it. But it's been fun. So what we had to actually do to get the propeller and gearbox unit to fit back inside properly was to turn the whole motor upside down and fit it from the bottom. The reason that that works is probably because what's happening when you're trying to put the shaft in the normal way, the drive shaft goes up the middle of here and it has to fit into a spline socket that's actually only about the same size as this. And if that shaft is even slightly out of line, it misses the socket and goes up the side here, and it bangs up against the engine base plate. So if you can feel as you're trying to push that in that you're hitting a really clunky resistance, that's probably what's happening. When you turn the thing upside down, like this, the force of gravity is actually helping to keep the shaft vertical, and then it's much more likely to go into the spline socket the way that you want it to go. What I also did that you can try too, which did seem to help, was I removed the clamp completely, the clamp that locks together the gear change shaft for the lower unit with the gear change shaft for the upper unit. I took that off completely, and I did that because I suspect that when you're feeding the linkage through that clamp, it's actually pulling the whole thing to one side a little bit, and again that's making it difficult to line up the drive shaft with the spline socket in here. That does mean that you're then going to have to refit that little clamp through the hole here, which is quite fiddly, but you can do it. The other thing I also did, let's just bring the camera in a little bit closer so that you can see what we're talking about here. When the unit is refitted, the lower gear change shaft comes up through here and pokes out of this little hole in the top of the lower housing. It's held in place there by a rubber grommet. I pulled that grommet out, so you've got a bigger hole for that to poke through, and then put the grommet back on top again afterwards. Put a little bit of grease on it, helps to get it back on. And I used a screwdriver as well. And again, that just makes life a wee bit easier. So what I would suggest then is, if you're doing this yourself, try it from below first. You never know, it might go in straight away for you and save you a lot of trouble. If you can't get it in like that, try without the clamp in place. That may work. You can also use the cargo strap that I showed before. That seems to work for some people. If none of those is working for you, don't force it, don't hit it, it won't help, you'll only go to do some damage. Turn the whole thing upside down and do it the way that I did it, upside down. Before you do that, drain the fuel tank and drain the oil tank in the engine, because you don't want petrol all over the place and you don't want oil running back into the cylinders or into the carburetor either. And then you'll probably get it together okay. But it was a real pain